Hi, my name is Vic, and today we are going to build a data pipeline using Airflow, a popular data engineering tool. Airflow lets you use Python to define and run very powerful and flexible data pipelines. This is going to be a beginner tutorial, so we'll start out by installing and configuring Airflow. Then we'll download podcast episodes and store them into a SQL database. At the end, you will have a data pipeline that you can continue to extend and use. You'll also have a good understanding of Airflow and how to use it. Let's dive in. By the end of this tutorial, you'll know how to build a data pipeline, or DAG, in Airflow. And we'll end up with a 4-step data pipeline. The first step will be able to create a SQLite table. The second will be to download podcast metadata. Then what we'll do is we'll download the actual podcast episodes and we'll store the episodes in our SQLite database. And you'll know also how to extend this pipeline and continue adding to it. So let's go ahead and get started with Airflow. In this tutorial, I'll be using PyCharm, which is a Python IDE. It's very popular. I really recommend downloading it. It's free. And what I'll have are two separate views. So the top here will be the Python file where we'll write our data pipelines and code. And the bottom will be the terminal where we will configure Airflow and install packages. So both will be open. The first thing we'll do is actually install Airflow. It's a little bit tricky, so I want to walk you through it. This website has the instructions for actually installing Airflow. And if we scroll down, we can see here the actual instructions that you have to run. So to install Airflow, you should have Python installed, and you also will need a virtual environment. It is highly recommended to install Airflow into a virtual environment. It's not 100% necessary. So if you, for whatever reason, don't want to make a virtual environment, you don't have to. But let me jump back to the terminal and I'll actually show you how to run these commands and install Airflow. The first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and check our Python version. In this case, I have version 3.9.12. Only the beginning part will be needed. So I'll only need 3.9. Then what we'll do is we'll define what's called a constraint URL. So I already typed this out, so I just auto-completed it. But what this URL does is it tells pip which optional dependencies to install based on your Python version. So constraints-2.3.1 over here. The 2.3.1 is the version of Airflow. And then 3.9 here is the Python version. So if you have Python 3.7 or 3.8, just go ahead and change that number to reflect that. And I'm going to install Airflow 2.3.1, but if you want to install a different version, you should go ahead and change that number too. So I'm going to hit enter. That's going to set an environment variable. And then when we actually do pip install, we'll use that environment variable to install the right constraints. So I'm doing pip install Apache Airflow. I'm specifying the version. Again, if you want to install a different version, you should just use that. And then I'm specifying the constraint file that we're using. So I'm going to hit enter. I've actually already installed everything, so it's not going to download anything, but you should see output that shows that it actually installed properly. The next thing we can do is we can actually go ahead and run Airflow. And what we can type is Airflow standalone. And this will create an Airflow server locally. It's not the absolute recommended way to run Airflow. You should run everything separately in production. But for our tutorial, running Airflow standalone is good enough, and it's an easy way to get started. So we're going to go ahead and run this command. And you should see all of this output. It's just configuring Airflow and setting up the server and all the other worker processes. But once it's done, you should see this. Airflow is ready, and you can log in with your username and password. And one thing you do when you run Airflow standalone is that you really want to make sure you're doing it in the same folder where everything else is. So you'll notice here I have my podcast summary 2.py file. That's the file that we're actually building the data pipeline in. When I run Airflow standalone, I want to be in that same folder. That's just going to make it easier to manage some paths and store some data. So make sure you do it in that folder. So now we can hop over to our browser and actually load the Airflow interface. And by default, Airflow will be at localhost :8080. And if you type that into your browser, you should end up on Airflow. You'll also need to type in the username and password if you haven't already logged in. All right, and when you start, you'll see these warnings. This is just telling you, hey, the configuration you're using is fine for testing, but don't use it in production, which is okay. We're not going to use this in production. If you are going to use this in production, there's some things you need to change to make the configuration more robust. Now what you'll see is you'll see a list of DAGs. So DAG is just directed acyclic graph. An easy way to think of it is just data pipeline. So each of these is essentially a data pipeline that's transforming data from one form into another form. And Airflow is really flexible, which we'll see in this tutorial. A data pipeline can be many, many, many things. Airflow doesn't care what happens in each individual task. It just is a way to actually chain tasks together and run them. So let's actually click into one of these example tasks that Airflow gives us by default and just take a look at what it looks like. So this first view here is called the grid view. So this shows you all of the times this DAG has been run and what happened with those runs. So if you're having trouble reading this, don't worry too much. But each column here is one run, and each of these rows is one specific task in the pipeline. If we click on graph, we can actually see the layout of the pipeline. So we can see which tasks connect with which other tasks. So this run after loop depends on all three of these tasks. If it's hard to read, don't worry too much about it. We're going to build a pipeline up step by step, and that'll help you understand what's going on here. Okay, so this is just an example DAG. Let's jump back out, and let's actually get started building our own data pipeline. So we want to build a data pipeline that downloads podcast metadata and then uses that metadata to download the actual episodes. We could do this without Airflow, but for tutorial purposes and just for the purposes of understanding Airflow better, we're going to use Airflow. There are also some nice things Airflow will do for us. Airflow will let us schedule this to run every day so we can get new podcast episodes when they come up. It also makes it really easy to extend our pipeline and add more to it, which we can do later on. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to import from airflow.decorators. We're going to import DAG and task. So DAG is how we define the pipeline, and task is how we define each individual task inside the pipeline. And we're going to import pendulum, which is built off of date time, and it is what we use to define start times and end times in Airflow. Now we're going to create a decorator called DAG, and this decorator will be used to decorate our data pipeline function. I'm going to call this podcast summary 2 because I already have a podcast summary on this machine, but feel free to call yours just podcast summary without the 2. Schedule interval, we're going to tell Airflow to run this pipeline daily. So as new podcast episodes come out, we will keep running this pipeline. We're going to set a start date, which is pendulum.datetime. And we're going to set that to be 2022-5/31, which was yesterday. And we're going to say catch-up equals false. All right. And then we're going to define our function, which will contain all of our logic for our data pipeline. So we're going to call this podcast summary 2. And for now, I'm just going to write pass to fill in the body of the function. So what's this doing? So what this is doing is this is creating our first data pipeline. We're using this decorator, this DAG decorator, to specify to Airflow that this function, podcast summary 2, is actually going to contain all of the logic of our data pipeline. Our data pipeline is going to have this ID. It's going to run daily, and the first time we're going to run it is on this date. And what we have to end this with is a call to our function. So we're going to say summary equals podcast summary 2. And when this is called, it'll actually initialize the data pipeline in Airflow. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to write the first task inside our pipeline. So we're going to use the task decorator to do this. This is using the TaskFlow API, which was introduced in Airflow 2. And basically what this does is it enables us to just write a function and have that function be treated as an Airflow task, which makes things a lot easier than creating. Previous to Airflow 2, you would create operators, and those operators would process the data. This is just an easier way to create an operator. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to actually download our podcast metadata. So let's take a look at the metadata and see what we're about to download. So I went to this URL in Chrome, and this is the URL we're going to be downloading, and it has our podcast metadata. So XML, which is the format that this metadata is in, is really, really hard to read. So I'm not going to try to make you read it right now. But this contains info on the podcast we're going to download, which is Marketplace, which is a financial news podcast. And it contains 50 individual episodes. So the last 50 episodes. And every day, the oldest episode is removed and one new episode is added. So this is continuously updated with the newest episodes. Our job then is to actually download these episodes and parse them. So to download them, we're going to use a library called requests, which I'm going to go ahead and import. And then to parse them, we're going to use a library called XML2dict. If you don't have these installed, you'll just need to pip install them. So let's go into our get episodes function. And then what we can do is we can say data equals requests.get. Actually, this URL. Request.get, and then I'll just copy and paste in the URL. So that's the URL we just visited. Then what I'm going to say is I'm going to use XML2dict to parse our data. So .text is going to be what we actually saw in the browser. It's going to be all of the raw XML. And then we're going to use this XML2dict library to parse that and get our result. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a Python console in PyCharm, and we can actually run this code and test it out. So let me go ahead and import these two libraries. And then let me go ahead and run this request.get, and let me do the parsing. So I'll just copy and paste all of this code in. And then we can take a look at feed. So feed is a dictionary, and we can take a look at the keys in this dictionary. And we can see the outer key is called RSS, and we can look at the keys inside. And then I took a look at this data before, but channel is the key that has the data we want. And then if we look another layer deeper, item has each of the episodes. So this code gives us a list of all of the individual podcast episodes that have been released. So we can jump back up to our task here. And what we can say is we can say episodes equals feed, RSS, channel, item. And this will give us a list of the 50 latest episodes released by Marketplace. And then we'll just print a little log message into Airflow that says found len episodes. So this will just say found 50 episodes if we parsed everything correctly. And then we'll return our episodes from this task. Okay, so this task will actually download the episodes for us and parse them and return them. And then another task we write can actually process those episodes. So finally, what we're going to do is we're going to say podcast episodes equals get episodes. So this will run the function, and what we're returning, this list of episodes, will be assigned to this podcast episodes variable. So we now have a basic data pipeline with a single task. And we can actually try this out in Airflow and run it and see what happens. So let's go ahead and do that. There's one other thing we'll do, and you may have actually not seen the the graph show up properly in the Airflow interface. But what we'll need to do is we'll need to actually edit the Airflow configuration, which is here. So it's at airflow/airflow-airflow.cfg. Hit enter. And what you'll need to do is set up this DAGs folder to point to the place where your podcast summary is. So it'll need to point to the folder that contains this podcast summary.py file. And what this will do is this tells Airflow where you're storing your data pipelines. Now, if you're building a pipeline in production, you want to have a centralized folder that everything goes into. But for our purposes right now, it's fine to just point this to whatever folder you happen to be building your data pipeline in. So just remember to set this to the right folder path. I should have shown that earlier. We can hop back to our server, our Airflow server, and we can scroll down, and we will find towards the end this podcast summary 2 DAG. It may show up as paused for you, and if it looks like this, just click it to unpause it. And then what you can do is you can click on the title to see information about this summary. So this shows us how many times this pipeline has been run, and it looks like it's been successful every time it's been run. So we can then click on graph, and we can see this pipeline. It's not much of a pipeline right now. There's only one task, but we can click into the task, and then we can click on log. And this will give us the most recent run. We'll be able to see the log. And we can see, if we look down here, that we did find 50 episodes, and that this task returned the list of episodes properly. So it looks like the parsing happened properly, and we can now go ahead and build our next task. So we'll jump back over to PyCharm, and we can actually get started on the next task, which is going to be creating a database to store these episodes into. We'll be storing them into a SQLite 3 database. And the first thing we'll have to do is actually create that database. So let's jump back to the terminal, and I'll click the little plus up here to start a new terminal session. And what we'll do is we will cd into our podcast summary folder. So you want to create the database in the same folder that you're writing this podcast summary Python file. And then what we'll do is we'll type SQLite 3 episodes.db, and then we'll type .databases, and this will just list the current database in SQLite, but it's a way to force SQLite to actually create the database. And then we'll type .quit. And now if we type ls.l to list the contents of the folder, we should see this episodes.db database. Oh, looks like I was using. Okay. And once we have the database, we can actually create a connection. And this is a way to tell Airflow where the database is and how to access it. So what we're going to do is we're going to type Airflow connections add podcasts. You can see I've typed this before. Con type SQLite, and then con host is users. I'll just autocomplete this. But what this is doing is it's telling Airflow that there is a database and it exists at this location. So this file where the connection host is, and it has this connection type, SQLite. And the name is podcasts. So we're going to hit enter. And in this case, I already created the connection. But if you are if you're just creating it from scratch, you should see a message indicating that it's been created. Okay. And now what we can do is we can just check to make sure that our database connection is configured correctly. And we can see that it is. So we have our podcast connection and it's pointing at the right database. So now what we can do is we can write another task in Airflow. And this task will help us create a table within this database. So first we're going to import from airflow.providers.sqlite.operators.sqlite. We'll import SQLite operator. And this is a task that lets us interact with databases. Okay, so we went ahead and imported it. Now we'll need to actually use it to create a task. So we're going to create a task called create database. And this is going to be a SQLite operator. And the task ID is going to be create table SQLite. And then what we do is we write some SQL code to pass into the operator to basically tell Airflow what to do. And what we want to do is we want to create a table. And we're going to call this table episodes. And we're basically saying, if this table doesn't already exist, create it. If it does exist, just don't do anything. And this is because we might be running this pipeline multiple times, and we don't want to recreate the table each time, right? We only want to create the table the first time. And this table will be called episodes, and it'll have a few fields. So it'll have the field link, which is going to be the primary key of the database. And this will be a text field. So this is going to be the link where the podcast is available. And that is unique, which is why we're using it as the primary key. Then the title of the podcast, then the file name. So this is the local file name where we're going to store the downloaded podcast episode. We'll have published, which is the date when the podcast was published. We'll have description, which is the description of the podcast. And those are our fields. So what this will do is it will create the database for us. Now this looks a little bit different from the other task we created because this is using our operator, our SQLite operator, which is an older way to make tasks. This is kind of the original way in Airflow to make tasks. And there are a lot of operators in Airflow. And these operators let you interact with things like Google Cloud, things like different databases. It's one of the most powerful aspects of Airflow. They're all of these built-in operators, so you don't have to write a bunch of code to do something. This style of building a task is called TaskFlow, and it was introduced in Airflow 2, so it's newer. And basically what this task decorator is doing is it's turning this into a Python operator. So previous to Airflow 2, we would have had to write a Python operator and pass data back and forth, and it would have taken a lot more code to actually do what we're doing here, getting the episodes and returning them. So we're using the newer TaskFlow API to create most of the functions here. But for this older SQLite operator, we need to use Airflow's functionality, which connects to SQLite. And there isn't an easy way to do that without actually calling the operator this way. So these are both tasks. They just look a little bit different because they're using slightly different ways to build tasks. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is actually call our create database function or task. And the way we'll do that is we'll say create database.set downstream podcast episodes. So what this is doing is it's saying first run, or it's saying run create database before you run get episodes. So this is telling Airflow how to order the different tasks. And this is only necessary because we're using this kind of older style of operator with a newer TaskFlow style task. So if we just had another task that looked like this, the way we would chain them together is a little bit different. And I'll show you how to do that. But we're just doing this because this is how you connect operators with TaskFlow tasks. So set downstream means run this first, then run get episodes. And we're passing in podcast episodes because Airflow works on the return value of the function. And that's what we're going to use to actually order them. Okay, so we can go ahead and save this. And we can jump over to our web interface. And what I'll do here is at the top right, I'll click this play icon and I'll hit trigger DAG. And this will trigger the data pipeline or DAG to run. And you can see it now has two steps and you can see them change color. So we created the table. Let's go ahead and take a look at the log here. So it basically executed this create table if not exists, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. And it then ran get episodes. So just reload this. And we can see they were both successful. The green color here means success. All right, we've built a real data pipeline with 2 steps. The next thing we'll do is add another step. So now what we've done is we have created a database to hold our episodes, and we're downloading the episodes. The next thing we need to do is actually store the episodes into the database. And to do that, we'll create a load episodes task. Okay. And in order to make this work, we will need to do some additional installation. We'll be using pandas in order to actually extract some of the data from the database in this function. So you'll need to do this, pip install Apache Airflow pandas to actually get things to work properly. Okay. Let's go ahead and start writing this task. So we'll again use a task decorator, and a decorator here, the task decorator, is just turning this into an Airflow task. The decorator is saying turn this function into an Airflow task. So let's go ahead and write this. So we'll call this load episodes, and this is going to take in some data. It's going to take in a list of episodes to actually load. And in this, we are going to use something called a SQLite hook. So we used an operator earlier, a SQLite operator, when we wanted the whole task to be interacting with SQLite. In this case, we're using a hook because a hook will make it easier to interact with SQLite within an existing Python task. And I'll show you how that looks in a little bit. But a hook basically enables you to more easily query and use SQLite from Python. Okay. So we have our SQLite hook imported, and then we'll initialize the hook by instantiating the class. And we'll have to pass in our connection ID. Okay. One thing I neglected to do in this create database is I neglected to pass in the connection ID. So I'll fix that now. So what the connection ID does is it tells Airflow which connection to use to actually run the code. And in this case, if you'll recall earlier, we typed in Airflow connections get podcasts, and it showed us this database, this episodes database. This is the database we want to be running our queries against, and we want to create the table in. So SQLite connection ID, neglected to do that. Okay, so let's go back to our load episodes function. And then what we'll write here is what we're going to do is query our database to figure out which episodes we already stored, because we don't want to store the same episodes twice. So what we'll say here is select star from episodes. Okay, I don't actually need to capitalize this, but I will because it's bothering me. So what this is going to do is it's going to query our episodes database and figure out if we already stored any of the episodes. And any episode we didn't store, we're going to actually write to the database. Any episode we already stored, we're just going to ignore. So let's write the code to actually do that. So first we'll say new episodes is just a list. And then we'll say for episode in episodes. So we'll iterate through all of the episodes that we got from this function. And as we iterate through, we'll process each episode. So we'll say for episode in episodes. And the first thing we'll do is we'll check if the episode is already in our database. So we'll say if episode link not in stored link dot values. So what this will do is it will check if our link for our episode is already in one of our database rows. And link, if you'll remember, was our primary key. So this is the key that's unique in our database. So you can only have one of each link, and link is unique for each episode. So this is basically checking if the episode is already in our database or not. And if it's not, what we're going to say is we're going to say file name equals F episode. I'm using a format string here. So episode link dot split / and then we will take the last part. Okay, so what is this doing? So let's jump back to our Python console, and you'll see we had links for our. So we had unique links for each episode that looked like this one. What this is doing is it's taking the very last part of this link. So in this case, this part, is this the end of globalization? And then what we're going to do is make this our file name. And our file name is the name that will store the downloaded podcast at. So we're just creating a file name here. We'll call this .mp3. So that's going to be our file name. And then what we'll do is we'll say new episodes.append episode link. These are the fields that we want to store from each episode. The link, the title, the pub date, which we'll store as published, and the description. And then finally, the file name, which we also want to store. All right. So new episodes at the end of this loop will have data on any episode that basically we don't already have in the database. And then we can use our hook to actually insert our rows into this table. So we'll say rows equals new episodes, and then our target fields. So these have to be in order. We're saying each item in this new episodes list has these fields in order: link, title, published, description, and file name. Okay, so when we finish running this, we will have loaded each of our new episodes into our database. So let me just write some code to actually call this, and we will pass in podcast episodes. So let's go ahead and save this. And then what we can do is jump back to our Airflow interface, and we can trigger a run and see what happens. Okay, so it hasn't quite picked up our new item yet. Okay, and we can see that now we have picked up our load episodes function. Sometimes you have to trigger it a couple times to get it to pick up new tasks. And then what we can do is we can trigger our DAG, and this will run all 3 of our tasks in order. You can see them running as things turn green. Okay, so everything's completed successfully. Let's go ahead and click on load episodes and look at the log and see what happened here. Okay, so we loaded a total of 50 rows. So it looks like everything was loaded properly. Let's run this again and see what happens. So we're running it a second time because I want you to see what happens when it tries to load data the second time. So let's go ahead and look at the log. And we can see this time we've loaded 0 rows because all of the episodes that we downloaded were already in the database. So we didn't create duplicates. Great. So let's move on. We can jump back to our terminal in PyCharm, and we can actually take a look at the database by typing SQLite3 episodes.db, and then we can run SQL commands. And I just typed select star from episodes, and we can see that we've selected all of our episodes, and we can see that all the fields look okay, which is perfect. Let me quit. So now let's go ahead and actually build our next task, which is going to be downloading the episodes. So let's go type in our task decorator again, and we will create a function called download episodes. And this will take in our list of episodes. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to pull out the exact URLs for the MP3 files that we'll be downloading from our data. And then we're actually going to download the files using those URLs. So if we go back to the Python console, you can see that this is the MP3 file. So it's nested inside this enclosure and this URL property. Okay, so let's write the code to do this. So we're going to loop through all of our episodes. And what we'll do is we'll again create a file name to actually store the file at. So we did this before. I'll just copy and paste, but it's just the episode link.mp3. And then we need to create a full path to the file. So we need to include a folder if we're going to store it in a specific folder. So I'm going to use the OS. Did I import OS? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and import OS. And I'm going to use the OS package to actually join our folder name. So our folder name is going to be episodes. And I'm going to join that with the file name. And this will give us a full path to the file that we're going to store. And then what I'll do is I'll check to see if the file exists already. And if it doesn't exist, we'll download it. If it does exist, we'll just skip it. And this ensures that we're not re-downloading the same file multiple times, which would be bad. You probably don't want to download 50 podcasts multiple times. Okay, so then we'll just print a quick diagnostic message. So we'll say downloading, and then we'll put in file name here. And then what we'll do is we can, again, just use requests to download our data. So we'll say request.get episode. And we saw where the data was in the dictionary. It was at enclosure at URL. So audio is now going to be the raw data of our MP3 file. And then we can open up a file locally, audio path, and we'll open it up in write binary mode as f, and we'll say f.write audio.content. Okay, so this is going to loop through each of our episodes that we downloaded in this get episodes task, so all of our episode metadata. Then it's going to check to see if we already downloaded it using this. If we didn't download it, then we will download the file and we'll write it to our local hard drive. All right, and then what we need to do is just wire up this task. So we'll say download episodes, podcast episodes, just to call this task. One thing you'll want to do is create an episodes folder, and this folder will hold all of the episodes that we download. And you'll notice this task is dependent on this task. Okay, so let's go ahead and save and see what this looks like. And once you run the DAG, you should see that everything finishes successfully. It might take a while to download all the episodes. In this case, I have already downloaded them, so we didn't spend time re-downloading everything for the purposes of this video. But it may take a while for your local machine to download everything. And once that's done, this whole pipeline should be working, all 4 steps. And now that things have run, we can jump back to PyCharm and we can actually see the episodes. So over here on the left are all the files in my project. I can see this episodes folder, and I can see each of the podcast episodes have been downloaded into this folder. And as the pipeline runs every day, new podcast episodes will be downloaded and will be stored into our database. So we did a lot today. We started out by defining a data pipeline using this DAG decorator. We then built an initial task to actually download episode metadata. Then we created a SQLite database to store the metadata into. Then we loaded the metadata into a SQLite database, and we ended by downloading each of the episodes. There is a lot more you can do with this project on your own if you would like. So, one of the really interesting things you can do is you can actually transcribe the audio of the podcast into text. And there's some sample code in the description if you would like to extend this, try that out. You could then actually summarize the text and think about building out really short summaries of each podcast. And what you could do is combine all of those summaries and the audio files into an HTML page that you could then render and click through and look at to see summaries of each podcast. You could also try this with multiple podcasts. We only tried Marketplace, but you could try this with many other podcasts where you can download the metadata and the episodes. So there's a lot you could do here to continue to extend this pipeline. But hopefully by now you have a good understanding of Airflow and how to use it.